which is events on the other side of the world, not just in a great power, but in a failed state, in a country that didn't work, that looked like it was no threat, was a tremendous threat to the United States. And then, in fact, threats that emerge abroad, whether they are terrorism or pandemic disease or refugee flows or criminal gangs, these things have a tremendous influence on America. You can't separate America from the world in that way. And putting America first requires us to care what happens in other places. So I hope that's clear. That was clear to me on 9/11. Eventually, I became much more focused on foreign policy issues, like a lot of us did. I remember being at Camp David working on the speech to announce the beginning of hostilities in the Afghan war. And I was working on at the president's desk in his cottage there, while he was on the couch directing military commanders to have, B-2 bombers coming from St. Louis and informing the leadership of Congress of imminent hostilities. And I remember him taking the telephone and putting his hand on it like this and saying, "Mike, do you have security clearance for any of this?" And my answer was, "No, actually, I don't." And he responded, "You do now," which illustrated how different my life became. We became very focused on potential threats to the United States, but also on what was happening in a specific circumstance. I won't go too much into it, but a lot of the energy and attention of the Bush administration was initially focused by the AIDS crisis. By the year 2000 to 2003, there was a cresting wave of death across Africa. There were 20 million people, or 20 to 30 million people with HIV. There were 50,000 people on treatment on the entire continent. When I went there, first went to Africa and visited South Africa, shanty towns, you would see grandparents and grandchildren because the entire intervening generation of people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s was gone. They no longer existed. And it was extraordinary, terrible human suffering. And that is, in many ways, what motivated President Bush initially on the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. And that was directed at scaling up treatment and doing prevention as quickly as possible to respond to a grand emergency. I became involved in those efforts at the White House as a policy advisor. And I began to travel in Africa with Mark Dybul, who is now head of the Global Fund, and was at the time the deputy of PEPFAR. And when we visited across highly endemic places in Africa and talked with health ministers, the initial discussions were very much about AIDS because it was a crisis. But then when you dug down about what the real long-term challenges that were faced, malaria came up in every single circumstance. And that was because of its humanitarian cost, because it strikes children. It's a horrible disease that strikes children. Its economic cost, an economic drag of more than a percentage point in GDP in highly endemic countries, that it undermined tourism. It had did a lot of things that really doomed countries to the economic backwaters. And so, when I went back, to make a long story short, and after the first administration, the first 4 years of the Bush administration, I actually had a heart attack, and I took a new role at the White House, which was as an assistant to the President for Policy and Strategic Planning, which took me out of the daily speechwriting business. And I became very focused on this set of issues. And going up to the Glen Eagles G8, this kind of action-forcing event, where Tony Blair was the host and was focusing on Africa, I knew along with others, that the president was going to need something to say, was going to need something to contribute in that focus of the Gleneagles G8 in 2003. And it was, there were very smart people at USAID and the National Security Council that were focused on this issue. But at the time, the person who was charged with going up to Capitol Hill to make the case for what the administration was doing on malaria told me that they were ashamed at the level of what we were doing. The person who had to explain our malaria policy to the Congress was ashamed at the level of our commitment. In preparation for the Gleneagles G8, I argued internally for the PMI, the President's Malaria Initiative. And when it came to the policy meeting in the Oval Office with everyone, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff, the Director of Office and Management and Budget, I was prepared really for bear with all my facts and figures on why malaria needed to be a focus. And the President leafed through his black briefing book and said, I've talked with Mike about this, I approve it. And that was the end of the discussion. Whenever he could be presented with a decision like that, where he was confident that there was going to be outcomes, President Bush was my most reliable ally in this set of issues. And that was true on that. It was true on AIDS. It was true on women's justice and empowerment initiatives. It was true on women's education initiatives that we undertook. And that was the background of PMI.
Well, it's proof that one person can make a difference. And thank you for being there and for carrying that forward. It's interesting. I had asked Mike in advance about understanding how President Bush came to this commitment, because it was genuine and it was real, and he pushed it hard, and PMI is still in existence today. I'll try the microphone again. So Mike, when you talk today to members of Congress, how do you help them understand this value proposition of funding for malaria, funding for global health, the critical total budget for foreign aid, which is under attack right now? What are the arguments that you think work?
Well, malaria is the single best example of how America can have a tremendous impact in the world for an affordable amount of money, and see, proven outcomes. This is an example that shows the power of bipartisanship. This has always been a bipartisan issue from the very beginning. It's been kind of a safe harbor from the bitterness of our politics. It's demonstrated that it's possible to act in, bold ways in the world with strong bipartisan support. And so I think the initiative actually has an additional significance as a model that this is even possible in our government now. It's a model of the power of leadership, because I'm an extraordinary fan of Tim Ziemer, Admiral Tim Ziemer, who headed the program both under President Bush and President Obama, which is unusual to say the least, that you have that continuity. And he was a tremendous leader in starting the program and pushing it forward. And it shows the power of advocacy, because this commitment has been maintained in Congress by people like you, showing members of Congress that there is a constituency for the most vulnerable people in the world in American politics. Everyone else has advocates in Washington. Everyone else has financial interests in Washington. And the most vulnerable people in the world don't have that unless people like you provide it. So in a lot of ways, malaria is a model of advocacy. More broadly, when it comes to this, the relationship between the hope of others and the success of the United States, I think we just see that in a number of issues around the world. I mean, we just saw an Ebola epidemic which was rooted in weak local health systems, which had a massive regional impact and had the potential of having a tremendous global impact. And that was all because of undeveloped health systems in a vulnerable part of the world. Our security, our health security, was dependent directly on the failures at that level and the successes at that level. If the country of Nigeria had not effectively prevented Ebola from going into Lagos, it would have been a global crisis in a way that would have been hard to predict how far it would go. So we have an immediate example of how the health of others matters to the United States. But it's true even more generally. Our prosperity depends on America appealing and growing markets. I think those are important arguments. I think our security depends on stability in large parts of the world, which really does depend on a feeling of hope and progress on the part of people. Ultimately, that's what builds stability. The stability of dictators is very temporary. The stability of hope is real and lasting. So I think all of those things are true, but I think there's also a compelling moral case here that appeals to many members of Congress, and that is, to much is given, much is required. That is often what President Bush said when asked about this set of issues. A set of moral responsibility of those blessed with resources when there is a need that we know 100% can be met. We know exactly how to solve this problem. It's not a mystery. We don't need more research, even though it's important to make the next stages easier, to have new technologies. I don't want to dismiss that. But we actually know how to solve this problem and have done it in large parts of the world. And the only reason it isn't solved everywhere is because of a lack of political will. That is the only reason it's not solved everywhere. So the U.S. needs to make this commitment. I would just throw in, I mentioned previously, there have been other periods in previous decades when some progress was made on malaria that was undermined by the fact that it was not followed up on effectively. And this is a tenuous success. It could go either way, towards regression or dramatic progress towards the possibility of malaria elimination, which is out there and not insane. It's not easy, but it's not insane. So I think that we need to focus on that.
So let me ask you to go to a column you recently wrote with Raj Shah, former Democratic head of USAID, where the two of you called for thinking about the America First policy in terms of a robust foreign policy agenda. How does that apply to the foreign aid budget that we're looking at today? How do we think about it? Are there more innovative and creative ways to make sure that we are funding these programs that are so critical and even finding allies for them?
Yes, I think that the advocates of these programs need to be open to innovation. It is very, very important. Bill Gates will often say we've solved maybe half of the mortality problem on malaria. The second half won't be solved in exactly the same way because the needs are quite different. And so I think investment in fundamental research is one point that we make is very, very important. There are controversial arguments out there about how we can get to the next stage of malaria, get to a malaria elimination. There are real interesting arguments going on about the genetic modification of mosquitoes and using drugs even when people are not sick to provide prevention. So I think technology does matter. I think we need to be on the cutting edge of these issues. But we try to make the case that these programs in particular, like PEPFAR, like PMI, are models of the way government should work. President Bush had a certain management approach and belief And it was basically that you need to align resources, authority, and accountability. You need adequate scale to actually solve problems. You need somebody in charge, and then someone who's accountable for measured outcomes. When you get those three things, you get dramatic progress. That's what makes progress. And in that way, PEPFAR and PMI are models of the way government should work in other areas. That's the case I often make to Republican members, is that, there are many areas of our government that are in need of reform and in need of pruning. I'm a conservative. I don't think that, I'm not opposed to all of that. But these programs are actually models of the way government should work. They're effective outcome-oriented programs where somebody was in charge and somebody accountable. And they've, done extraordinary things. So I think that that's part of the case that needs to be made as well.
So I'm going to open it up in just a minute to questions, so I want to give you that heads up and warning. But Mike, if you would talk a little bit more about how we can think about the situation we're in today. We're 100 days into a new administration. There's a lot of learning to be done. A lot of people aren't even in place. How do we think about making sure that we're advocating in the best possible way? So I think you've given us a couple clues toward this, but ways that we might even talk about the federal budget, ways we might talk about the importance of foreign aid as an ongoing part, because it's not just about this program that we care about, but in fact all of the total foreign assistance budget. What are some of the other lessons that you learned and that you think could be applied today? I know you write about this on a fairly regular basis.
Well, one of the things that you can push back hard on is that somehow we have a deficit problem because the amount of money we spend on AIDS drugs and bed nets. That is an absurd notion. We have a deficit problem because of fundamental economic facts that have to do with American entitlement programs and the commitments we've made and the aging population and the increase in the expense of health care. That's the reason we have a major long-term deficit crisis. When someone says, I'm going to solve the deficit crisis by cutting foreign aid, they are distracting from the real issues, real economic issues that need to be faced. They're actually undermining the necessary resolve to focus on the long-term things that matter. This is less than 1% of the budget in toto. That is what we get for it is just pretty extraordinary. What we get for it in goodwill, what we get for it in stability. And I think to this administration, who is suspect of military intervention, at least in theory, that there's a very important case to be made that we need non-military tools of national influence in American foreign policy. How do we influence what goes on in the world without using the U.S. military? And the way that you do that is, interventions all the way from trade, which is very important, which an argument that needs to be made in this administration. But this is one of the ways that we can influence security environments in the world without military interventions. The problem which people in the military point out, including our current Secretary of Defense, is when problems get so bad that they require the military, that expands our commitments in ways that strain our country and cause terrible suffering with our military and military families. We need to be able to intervene in crises early enough to make a difference. And the way that we do that, one of the ways that we do that, I think, is by promoting economic growth, fighting extreme poverty, and promoting global health, where America has really tremendous successes. So I think that's part of America First, is that we that the United States, this is the best of our soul, but it also is the best of our interests. And that, I think, is a valid case to make.
Great. Let me see if anybody in the audience wants to put up a hand. You know, I think you've also reinforced for us that this is a bipartisan issue. We've said that from day one, and it remains that, so it's very important. I see a hand back here. Can you identify your name and where you're from?
Hello, my name is Winston. I'm from Wilmington, Delaware. First off, I want to start by thanking you, both of you, for taking the time to talk to us in this morning. So my question for you would be, I think over and over again, we're seeing Democratic and Republican legislators refusing to cooperate on anything. And it seems to me that they're more focused on their partisan agenda as opposed to for the greater good. So my question for you would be, as advocators, how would we encourage them to, you know, bypass the partisan line and keep the dialogue open for a solution, better solution? Thank you.
I want to hear your thoughts on this. But I would point out that some of these programs we're talking about were exceptions to that. And there are exceptions in our political life. You know, when at the period that we passed PEPFAR in 2003, in 4 months, it went from announcement in the State of the Union till the approval of the law, which was extraordinary progress. That was a period of bitter division in American life because of Iraq, because of a lot of other issues at the time. That was, I think, as bad as our moment in many ways. But when President Bush in the 2003 State of the Union address announced the PEPFAR, $15 billion for AIDS relief and prevention and compassionate care, almost immediately, Democrats stood up. Nancy Pelosi became the lead sponsor in the House, along with Henry Hyde, which you guys won't remember, but was a very conservative pro-life member of Congress from Illinois, who was the Republican sponsor. In the Senate, we had support from Senator Biden and Senator Kerry, and it really was striking how, in a time of bitterness, that it was possible to accomplish something. I'll add one more thing that's hopeful. So at the end of the last Congress, you know, we have a very broken system. A lot of people share your concerns, as I do, about how we make progress in our system. But the Obama administration had announced something called Power Africa, which was an attempt to encourage power production, to encourage development in large parts of Africa that didn't have electricity for things like studying at night or vaccine storage or a lot of medical uses. That bill was passed in the latter part of the previous Congress in a way that did not get much attention, but showed a constituency beneath the surface for these ideas. This set of ideas has always benefited from one thing, in my view, which is committed champions that rise up in Congress and take risks to defend these policies. And they're often people motivated by conscience. But they really need, I won't call it the cover, but they need the protection of a knowledge that people in their state and their district actually care about the set of issues that they're taking risks on. People that take these risks are heroic and deserve praise, but we make it easier for them to do that through effective advocacy. That's one of the things advocacy really does. So I would, agree with you, this is a huge problem, but there are genuine exceptions to this when you have the proper leadership.
Well, and it's good. It's a good reminder. You're up here today to say please and thank you, because that thank you is really credible. You know, just listening to you, I'm thinking this is a coalition that's made up of a bunch of Bs: basketball players, Boy Scouts, bishops, and business people. And that's a very powerful addition to the bipartisan thing that we're living in. So I just want to point that out. I see a hand here and a hand here, and so maybe we'll take 2 or 3 right now and then try to wrap them together.
Hi, my name is Sammy. I'm from Cary, North Carolina, and my question was, how would you guys counter those on either side of the aisle who believe that this isn't really the responsibility of the United States to contribute that funding or to help out in any way, that this isn't our job?
Thank you. Good question. Sir, with the pink.
Hello. Thank you for this interesting discussion. My name is Nashwan from Chicago, Illinois, originally from Syria. It's not a secret if we say that this world cannot function without United States. I want to ask you how we can encourage other countries to increase their support to United Nations and United Nations agency, and also at the same time how we can minimize their negative contribution when United States, for any reason, choose to withdraw from supporting an agency or a certain cause. Because when United States showing that it's not interested anymore in funding something, other people will follow, other countries. That's why we want to minimize this. So I would like if you can highlight this issue.
Great. And in the back there.
Hi, my name is Sharita Kiana Madison. I'm a community scholar and a refugee and disabilities advocate from Denver, Colorado. The question that I would like to ask is, when we are trying to help get other community members and constituents on board, and some of the facts that you shared, Mike, what resources do you suggest that we share with other community members to go to get the kinds of factual information that you were sharing today that will better enable us to do our advocacy? But when we're trying to help other community members find those resources for their own, if you have suggestions on that, that would be very helpful, because I feel like in today's media, it can be very hard to decide where to go for those resources.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
And I saw a young man right here, so if you walk up here, I'll give you my mic, because I don't see a mic nearby.
My name is Joshua Andes. I'm a Nothing But Nets champion and JCI Youth. My question is, what is the reason for the current administration to cut the foreign aid assistance funds?
That's a very good question.
Great. So, Mike, take it away. Thank you.
I think the answer to that question has to do with this question about what is our responsibility in the world. And the fact here is there have been other points in our history, and this is one reason history is worth studying, where America tried to live with the illusion that what happened in foreign places didn't matter to us. That happened in World War II, where there were forces that were called America First at the time, which argued that what was happening in Europe was none of our responsibility, that we would not be affected by it at all, that we were separated by oceans. And of course, having a continent of Europe dominated by the Nazis would have been both a humanitarian and security disaster for the United States. So those arguments were combated at that time by Franklin Roosevelt, who made the case that what matters abroad matters to us as well here at home. That was true during the Cold War. People made that same argument. Why are we balancing the Soviet Union in various parts of the world? And of course, our interests would have been tremendously implicated if there had been Russian nuclear weapons in Cuba that could have, hit all over the southern United States. That would have been a real threat. We oppose those kind of threats for important reasons because it does matter to us. And now we're in a circumstance where we do face some great power rivalry from like Russia and China. But that's not even the main problem. A lot of the problems we face in the world, whether it is terrorism, whether it is pandemic disease, whether it is refugee flows, whether it is drug cartels, these are often problems that emerge in weak and fragile countries. That's where they take root. They're kind of like, these problems are like parasites. When a country is weak, their immune system is weak, these problems can take terrible root and become challenges to the United States very, very quickly. So I would say these things matter to the security, eventually matter to the security of the United States. But I would also say that one of the things about being an American citizen, and one reason we're different from some other countries, is that we were founded on a creed, on a set of beliefs embodied in the Declaration of Independence, clarified by a great Civil War and a great leader, Abraham Lincoln, who said, everyone matters, everybody counts, no insignificant person was ever born, and these rights are universal. They're not just ours, they belong to everybody. That doesn't mean we can solve every problem in the world, but where we can make a difference, we can serve the cause of human dignity. That is something that America should do. We did that in the Marshall Plan after World War II, where we helped rebuild Europe and Japan, our enemies. We helped rebuild our enemies because it was good for the world. We do it through the Peace Corps, which was John Kennedy's effort to show the good heart of America, which is true. We do it through PEPFAR. We do it through the President's Malaria Initiative. And we do it through the Global Fund, which is a good example of involving other countries in these efforts. The U.S. gives 1/3 of the funding for the Global Fund. The remaining 2/3 is supplied by other countries. And that ratio, we keep that ratio for a reason, because we want other countries to be involved in these efforts. But I think there are good security reasons. I think there are good moral reasons why we should care about what happened to others.
I want to stop it right there because that's so perfect. I'll just say one quick thing about the UN. I think we do see that if the U.S. doesn't keep its negotiated role and level of commitment, others might do one of two things. They might step back too and think this is the opportunity to do less. Others might step in, and we need to think about how that affects. Right, that affects how our. Right, right. So I think we need to be careful with this issue, and just think about what you ask for. So, Mike, I may ask you to.
Just about your resources on these things. I mean, the resources I know. I'm part of the One campaign. I don't know if you know One. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm part of the One campaign, which is a national grassroots effort to promote development and fight global diseases. That was founded by Bono. That's where I office. That's where I am. They have resources. I'm part of an organization called USGLC, the U.S. Global Leadership Council, and they also have resources. But I know you guys do as well, so I want to.
Yeah, well, resources are critical, and right now I would say we all need to think about resources because this is a battle for the future. And we led a campaign last year called Vote Like the World Depends on It. Today it's Act Like the World Depends on It. So we need all the help we can get. I'm proud of everybody who contributes to this campaign and to help make sure that it has the resources it needs to tell the story, engage in communities, and talk to members of Congress. Across the board, we have funding that helps us with issues around adolescent girls, clean energy, reproductive health for women and men. We think these are issues that need to be brought to the fore, and of course we spend most of our time and raise a lot of resources to make sure that we also can tell the story of the UN's value, strategic value to the U.S. on a regular and daily basis, and make sure that the UN itself has the support it needs to make the reforms it needs to as well. So resources are critical, and I think this is a good period because people seem to want to make a difference today and help. And so in all of your communities, hopefully you're able to make the case that there's an important opportunity for everybody to step up and support these kinds of efforts that really build coalitions to change our country for the best. So thank you all very much for being with us, and let's thank Mike. This was an incredible interview.